Well, the Snowballer has been buffed. However, this buff wasn't in this PvP update. No, it's been in the game for like 3 weeks, and nobody has noticed it. It's not me nor Mentin, and me and Mentin like check out like which towers have been updated or not. Because it turns out it's for the Snowballer, and the Snowballer, let's be real, nobody uses it. Many people have said that the Snowballer is the worst tower in Tower Defense Simulator, and let's be real, I have to agree. Like, the only other tower that may come close to being the worst tower in Tower Defense Simulator could be like the Halibut, and even then, the Halibut does have its uses. It can push back enemies, it can set enemies on fire, and it can detect flying enemies. Whereas a Snowballer, what the hell can it detect? Can it even detect lead enemies? I don't think it can detect lead enemies, speaking about it. Yeah, utterly useless tower. However, in this update, well, actually, the update 3 weeks ago, they may have, you know, added lead detection to it. I don't think they have, though. And also, no, this isn't a PvP exclusive change. So, in PvP mode, some towers have changed, and you can see this if you switch between PvP mode and PvE mode. So, as you can see, for something like the Brawler, you can see 0.6, 6 range, 6 damage, and 6 placement. And if you switch over to PvE, it's 10 damage and 6. However, when it comes to the Snowballer, you can't place it down because event towers are banned in PvP mode. So, what has changed about the Snowballer? Well, at level 0, nothing has changed. Yeah, absolutely nothing. So, it still has 4 damage, it still has a fire rate of 3, it still has a range of 9.5, it still has a max slowdown of 30%, it still has a slowdown per hit of 15%, it still has a slowdown time of 3, you get it. However, what has changed is the fact that at level 1, the amount of damage that it deals has increased from 4 to 5. Yes, such an amazing buff. You get 25% extra damage, which actually, thinking about it, actually doesn't sound too bad, I'll be totally honest. And that is the only change. So you're going from a DPS of 1.59 to 1.99, meaning that the cost efficiency for the Snowballer, Hail Mary this, you're going from 251.57 to 201. Which, actually, thinking about it, that's not terrible. Although, that being said, I think some towers have been buffed to that, so that their DPS is actually lower than this. It's about, sorry, not their DPS, their cost efficiency is lower than about 200. Meaning that, actually, the Snowballer is probably still bad when you consider everything. Plus the fact that it still has very short range. It has, what, a range of, I have skills on, but I think about 10? No, okay, it has range of 11. So, it's not terrible range, but it's pretty short, I can't lie. And for $400, it's something, I guess. However, one does need to compare this to the Scout. So for $400, you can get the level 2 Scout, right? Which has a DPS of 2.48 and a cost efficiency of 161.29, and its range is 14. Whereas the range for the Snowballer is 11, deals 5 damage, actually, never mind, it has been buffed. And its cost efficiency is 201. The one redeeming factor is that it does have slowdown, but do bear in mind that the Snowballer can't slow down enemies with boss immunity, and I don't think its slowdown has an effect on enemies with no freeze, although actually, when you're placing down the Snowballer early on, I don't think there'll be many enemies that have no freeze, so yeah, you know, it's a good choice. If you consider the fact that the Scout also exists, and I think the Scout is much better and probably scales a lot better considering the fact that the Snowballer only has 3 levels while the Scout has 4 levels, and 4 levels is quite small nowadays. Also, is it me or does the Snowballer not have any sound effects, or am I just deaf? I think it doesn't have any sound effects. That's really odd. I thought it did have sound effects. I don't know what. Right, next, the Snowballer at level 2, its damage has increased from 8 to 10. So what, another 25% increase? Yep, 100%. Totally worth it. However, that being said, I'm surprised that the testers didn't tell us that, yes, the Snowballer has been buffed. Maybe they were waiting on whether someone would recognize that the Snowballer has been buffed. So the Snowballer has been buffed. I don't know if they've actually had any testing with the Snowballer, given the fact that this is literally the worst tower in Tower Defense Simulator. Anyways, this means that the DPS for the Snowballer has increased from 3.19 to 3.98. So cost efficiency going from 266.46 to 213.57. Now, $850, right? If we would compare this to the Scout, what would you get that for? Well, it's actually halfway in between the Scout's level 2 and level 3 upgrade. The level 2 upgrade costs $400 total, and the level 3 upgrade costs $1,350. Right, so the Scout actually has less damage than the Snowballer. Ooh, interesting. So the thing with the Snowballer is that its fire rate is actually quite high, so that means that it shoots a lot slower, therefore meaning that its DPS of 3.19 isn't that favorable when you compare it to the 1350 Scout, which has a DPS of 8.47 and a cost efficiency of 159.39. So yes, while the Snowballer can slow down enemies, as you can see here, it's slowing down the ghoul, let's be real, the Freezer can do this. And I think I prefer to choose the Freezer over the Snowballer. Because do bear in mind that for around this cost, you can get the level 1 Freezer, which costs $650. Its damage is 2, which, yes, it's lower than the Snowballer. So, yes, the Snowballer does deal more damage than the Freezer. But do bear in mind that the Freezer has a much lower fire rate, and its DPS is actually only marginally lower than the Snowballer, and it costs $200 less at level 1. So the level 1 Freezer has 3.94 DPS, while the Snowballer has 3.98 DPS, therefore meaning that the cost efficiency of the Freezer is 164.97 at this level. And as it turns out, the Snowballer actually can freeze enemies to the same effect as the Freezer. So at this level, at level 2 for the Snowballer, it can freeze enemies by up to 60%, whereas the Freezer at level 1 can also freeze enemies by up to 60%. However, it's interesting here that the Snowballer can freeze enemies by 30% per snowball, whereas the Freezer can only freeze enemies by 20% per hit. However, you do bear in mind that the Freezer can hit more enemies per second compared to the Snowballer. The Snowballer can hit an enemy every 2.5 seconds, whereas the Freezer can hit an enemy, 2 enemies in fact, per second. So, I mean, overall, I think the Freezer wins in that regard, slowing down enemies. I mean, I guess if you're slowing down a singular enemy, the Snowballer has a very, very niche thing where you can slow down a high health enemy very early on during the game, but so long that enemy is not a boss, and so long there is only one of that enemy, because if there's more than one of those enemies, the Snowballer is very weak because of its fire rate. And the damage buff that the Snowballer gets at this level, while it's like sort of comparable to the Freezer, and the Snowballer could be compared to like a major boss, or no, not even a major boss because it can't slow them down, just like a high health enemy Freezer, it's only really in that regard early on, and obviously it becomes useless. But how useless? Because actually later on, there's been sort of a big buff. It's still a 25% buff in damage. You're going from 20 damage to 25 damage at max level for the Snowballer, which is just level 3. But that means that the DPS for the Snowballer has increased from 9.96 to 12.45. Yes, the Snowballer has actually now broken 10 DPS, which I find very surprising. Therefore, meaning that the cost efficiency for the Snowballer has gone from 271.08 to 216.86. So, you know, the Snowballer, it's going up in the world. However, when you compare this to the Freezer, so for this level, $2,700, and like a comparable level for the Snowballer, it's probably like level 2, 1,300. In fact, it's like in between the Snowballer's level 2 and level 3. Level 3 costs 3,300, whereas level 2 costs 1,300. And yes, actually, the Snowballer has a higher DPS at level 3 compared to the Freezer's level 3, and the Snowballer actually costs less. So actually, maybe the Snowballer is a better Freezer, because the DPS for the Snowballer at level 3 is 12.45, whereas the DPS for the Freezer at level 3, do bear in mind it's higher, it costs much more, is 8.68. So in this regard, yes, the Snowballer is actually surprisingly better than the Freezer. Plus, the Snowballer can hit multiple enemies at this level, 4 enemies, whereas the Freezer can't. No, it can't. But the Snowballer can freeze enemies for 2 seconds, whereas the Freezer can freeze enemies for 2.5 seconds. So, yeah, the freeze time is slightly longer for the Freezer. And its slowdown time for the Freezer is 5 seconds compared to the Snowballer's 4 seconds. But that being said, the Snowballer can hit multiple enemies. So in that regard, actually, the Snowballer, ironically enough, might not be the worst tower in Tower Defense Simulator. I think the Freezer, up until level 3, is actually worse than the Snowballer. However, I must say that the Freezer does have a trump card in that it does have a level 4. And I think the level 4 upgrade for the Freezer actually might be useful. Because at level 4, yes, it gets 5 damage, it has a range, it has a burst of 6, but it also has the Frost Grenade ability, which can freeze multiple enemies. Now, actually, to be fair, I don't really see many people using the freezer too often, apart from maybe in ranked PvP matches when we've banned the Electroshocker, for example, and we just need a tower that actually slows down enemies. But like the DPS for the Snowballer is... I mean, well, it doesn't compare to the freezer. The freezer at max level only has 18.86, whereas the Snowballer has 12.45, and the freezer costs $7,800 for a cost efficiency of 417.56, whereas the Snowballer is significantly cheaper than that due to the buffs. So actually, I am going to say this, probably controversially, the Snowballer is perhaps no longer the worst tower in Tower Defense Simulator. I think the freezer is worse than the Snowballer now. And the only reason why I think the freezer is probably going to be used more than the Snowballer is because of PvP matches where the Snowballer can't be used at all in those matches because event towers and exclusive towers are banned. But yes, it's surprising that actually the worst tower in Tower Defense Simulator is no longer the worst tower, in my opinion. I think that many people will probably still say that is the worst tower. And actually thinking about it, in terms of uses for the freezer, most people would use the freezer in like the Hidden Wave, for example, because of its burst. It can burst 6 times, which can freeze theoretically up to like 6 enemies. Whereas a Snowballer, its uses are like very, very niche because, well, it doesn't really freeze enemies all too well. I mean, like I said, the freezer, its maximum burst is like 7 at level 4. And so, theoretically, you can freeze up to 7 enemies. But I could argue that the Snowballer could have some use. I mean, like, if you're looking at this, right? Looking at the Reaver and then looking at the failed experiments, the Snowballer actually kind of slows it down quite significantly. Again, it is just one major boss, and I assume in like a horde of waves, maybe the Snowballer isn't so good. But do bear in mind that the Snowballer has 4 max hits. So, perhaps, maybe, instead of using the freezer, use the Snowballer? Question mark? I don't know. Maybe the Snowballer is actually better than the freezer. It's controversial, but that's what I think because of this buff. Would be very funny to see the Snowballer being used in the Hidden Wave instead of the freezer. Although, even though I think like the Electroshocker is better for the Hidden Wave, but obviously there is a certain limit because of how the mechanics of slowing down works, so you might as well have a freezing tower. And like, yeah, sure, the Chiromancer is probably better than like the Snowballer when it comes to freezing enemies, but in terms of being cheap to place down, which is not a really concern in the Hidden Wave, the Snowballer hits sometimes, I guess. Yeah, I know, who cares? The Chiromancer is probably better.